Today I wanted to talk about work, identity, and how capitalism kind of feeds into that. So today's video is about not being a yuppie, not being a hippie, but kind of disentangling the idea of my own work and my own identity away from capitalism. So hi, if you've never seen this channel before, I'm Kian and this is option C. And we talk about, you know, stuff that's kind of like not the default option, which is A, not the immediate direct antithesis of that, which is option B, but something else that, we choose, which is why it's called option C. So something I've been thinking about recently is the idea of work and how the idea of work in our society is very much entangled with the idea of capitalism. So a few years back, I think it's a few years back, there was this idea of I don't dream of labor and also other movements where I really also, bought a lot into that. And I think when we talk about work in those sense, I guess in the most general sense of those conversations, the ones that are not particularly nuanced, a lot of the times the work we're talking about is really about work done in the context of capitalism. So a lot of times it is work done for money or in exchange of money, some form of paid employment. And that is also how I've generally thought about my own work. And I think entangled within that because as a society, I think we are very... It's quite common, let's just say, to put the idea of like who we are, put a lot of stock of who we are in relation to our jobs, right? So I think that's kind of the basis of like how work and identity generally plays into each other. So I'm going to talk a bit about the terms that I wanted to talk about today, which is yuppie and hippie. So I'm not particularly attached to any of these terms. I don't really use them in full, but I think it's useful to use them as markers just to get a sense of like a ballpark of where we are. So a yuppie is a young urban professional, and I think the way I look at it is kind of like just the idea of someone who is well, it doesn't really have to be young, but I think the idea of like a urban and professional person. So in my head, that's always been somebody who is like a worker in the capitalist sense, like a professional, some words associated with it. I guess it's funny because it's outfit styles, but I think like it sort of plays back into it. So let me just list them first. So things like dandy, preppy, even hipster kind of falls into the idea of yuppie. And it's funny how kind of like dressing plays into the idea of this identity and how this identity is also in turn associated with work, because I will talk a bit about how it plays into my own identity of that as well. But let me just continue defining hippie and then we'll come back to that. So hippie is I guess really originates from kind of like a free, somewhat rebellious movement. I'm not using it entirely in its original historical context, I think, but I see it as a rebellion against the kind of like professional worker yuppie context. And a lot of this rebellion, I mean, the hippie look adjacent styles including like bohemian are kind of like reminiscent of the kind of, I guess, shabby chic is kind of in the same ballpark. But what I think is interesting about that is Also, more recent movements like lying flat, 躺平, and even to some extent quiet quitting, because I know they're not the same, but if we're talking in the context of an established convention and the kind of more immediate reaction to this convention, they are not the same in the context of like hippie, lying flat, quiet quitting. They don't refer to exactly the same thing, but I think they all come about in a very similar spirit of being like an immediate retaliation against the yuppie context, the idea of being a professional capitalist worker. So we'll eventually get to the point about how I've sort of figured out how to disentangle my work and identity away from capitalism. But let's go back to the front part a bit about the yuppie context. So this being a personal vlog channel, I of course want to frame this whole thing in terms of my own personal experience and how I've personally understood all this through my own personal experience. So if you watch some of my other videos, you might know that I started work after graduation in an office job. So I think on the outside I definitely could fit in the context of being a yuppie, and I mean I don't think I fully assimilated into it, but I don't think I've fully like outright on the outside rejected it. So in the context of work, I would dress the way that I was supposed to in an office, and for me that meant like a dress shirt, not this kind, but like it's quite funny because actually this shirt kind of makes me think of like vaguely hippie, like a yeah, it's closer to hippie to me than it is to yuppie. I don't know how true that is, but at least that's the vibe for me. Yeah, but back to when I was working in an office, I dressed in a shirt, like yeah, shirt, blouse, whatever you want to call it, and generally trousers, slacks, tailored pants, whatever you want to call that. So it's meant for like a work setting. It is professional, preppy, whatever you want to call that. And I dressed the part. I mean, I even had a blazer at some point because hoodies are weird in the context of where I was working. For like when you get cold in the office because it's air conditioned, which is a Singapore thing. Anyway, so during the context of during the period where I was working and in the situation of being at a workplace, that is how I dressed. And I also got to a point where I did buy I started with flats, and then I went to a point where I actually bought like leather dress shoes. But the whole time, and I think it's funny because I'm talking about it in terms of clothes, but it kind of it's all related. So the whole time I was working during those 4+ years, anytime that it wasn't a work day and I wasn't at work, I had the urge to dress myself in what is generally an outfit that looks like a t-shirt, shorts or jeans, and sneakers or even slippers. And I don't think I fully realized it at that time, right? But I think that was my own subconscious way of trying to rebel against this whole idea of being a yuppie, kind of being like, no, even though I'm performing as a yuppie on the outside to the people at work, I don't personally feel like I am a yuppie, and my retaliation or my rebellion is to basically dress like I was still in university or secondary school. So that was me in kind of my yuppie phase. And in terms of work, right, I didn't hate what I do, but I didn't particularly love it. It was just kind of like I could be good at what I do. I mean, I was good at what I do, what I did, but like it didn't really matter what I did in a sense. Like it didn't matter to me personally, although like maybe on an ideals level, I could see how the work I was doing was impactful, useful, etc. But on a personal level, it wasn't like it didn't quite have the spark that I really wanted out of work. So that was my experience of being a yuppie. And then initially I was thinking I don't think I've ever really gone through a like hippie phase, but I think my fun employment period and also the whole general gist of like the way I dressed. So the moment I was in my fun employment period where I wasn't required to be in professional clothes at all, those work clothes basically just sat mostly untouched on one side of my wardrobe, and I was living mostly in the same stuff that I usually did on my rest days, which is t-shirt, shorts, jeans, sneakers. It's basically what you usually see me in videos. And it took a while, interestingly enough, for me to start incorporating bits and pieces of what I've termed my work wardrobe back into my regular wardrobe. So after a while, I started being more okay and relaxed with wearing, like, say, slacks with t-shirts or a button up with shorts or something like that. I mean, it's not like we're not really here talking about clothes, but I think the clothes here is kind of like a surface representation of how I was viewing my identity at that time. And I think the moment I wasn't required to perform being a yuppie, I didn't have the need to so strongly show that I was a hippie in my sense of trying to show it through how I dress. And then I could, be a bit more free to really dress how I wanted to, which is sometimes somewhere in between. I've never really gone back to really wearing like my full like work outfit in general when I have the choice when I'm not working. But I think I've stopped being so reluctant to, use it, because those are actually clothes I like, But when I was in a position where I felt like I didn't have a choice, I didn't want to be reminded of that. So, in this hippie phase of work, or rather not work, and what that looked like for me was my fun employment period, which I've talked about in bits and pieces, and I'll link the relevant videos like here and in the description as well. But I think the immediate retaliation for me was not to... Well, there was two immediate retaliation. One was to kind of just rest, like in opposition to doing work. And then the second was kind of to do work that I liked for its own sake. So in absolute terms, what that meant for me was that I stopped working for a paycheck in an office job, but I did end up taking on door painting commissions, which I was paid for, but it wasn't really at a rate that was, like, it wasn't a paying job in that sense. Like, I was earning less than minimum wage. Not that there is minimum wage in Singapore, but I think at that point I wasn't very clear about dividing work away from capitalism. But to me, and this will become clearer as I continue talking about it, but later, which is now, I will come to the realization that work is actually a thing in and of itself away from capitalism. But I think at that point when I was doing that fine employment, where I had the inherent need to work, but I haven't fully disentangled work away from capitalism, I was kind of struggling with the idea of how I viewed myself, my work, my identity, without having the benefit of knowing that I could see all of these things as being separate. Well, not necessarily separate, but I didn't only have to see it through the lens of capitalism. Like, I could choose to see it in the lens of capitalism or without. Like now I'm at a point where I can sort of like, okay, I see it with capitalism or without, like with an extra lens or without. I have this option, but at that point in time it was all entangled together and I couldn't really filter out how capitalism was deeply entrenched in all my thoughts about my work, my life, and my identity. So now, so something that I've thought about recently and sort of come to a realization is really that I like work, and by that I mean work that is not inherently, that definition of work that I'm talking about is not one that is inherently tied to capitalism, although it could be. So when I talk about work, what I really mean when I say I like work is I like kind of just exerting effort, exerting time, putting care into doing something, because I enjoy doing it, because it's something that I just find myself doing. I feel like for a lot of humans, if you really come right down to it, people want to work. Like, if you divide work from capitalism in its definitions, a lot of people actually enjoy doing work. I think it's the idea of doing work under a capitalist framework that we have some issues with, but it's so difficult to talk about because most of us haven't gotten to a point of disentangling work from capitalism. So we are faced with this weird, like, confusing notion of like, sometimes I like to work but sometimes I don't, and like, what is this thing that's kind of determining how that works out? And for me, that is capitalism. Like, broken down to its base, I like work. I don't mind the exertion of effort, of like sometimes the fatigue that comes after that. Like, if the work itself is meaningful and enjoyable, like, that's good enough, So I enjoy work in and of itself. And it's a bit funny to say that, because for a time I was also in the camp of being like, oh yeah, I don't dream of labor. But really, I think I don't dream of labor is talking about work under capitalism, and I don't dream of being forced to work under capitalism for the vision of somebody else, especially if that somebody else's vision is not something that I'm personally aligned with. And I think that is where like labor sort of, I don't dream of labor comes in. But about work in and of itself as just like maybe even just a scientific term of like, force times distance move is work done, right? I hope I got the formula correct. It's been years since I've done science in that context. But like, it's really just about exerting the effort and getting something done out of it, right? So I enjoy work, and it's much more freeing to be able to say that now after I've disentangled and divided capitalism away from work, to be able to own up to the fact that yes, I enjoy work, and no, I do not enjoy working under capitalism. I'm not, like, I'm not that delusional, but I can own the fact that I enjoy work. And I'm just gonna drop it in. I'm not gonna explain it too much, but like, if you know about human design, there is a particular type in human design called the generator, and another either type or subtype depending on how you see it, called the manifesting generator. And this makes up like 70% of the human population. And both generators and manifesting generators are people who, when they do things that excite them, have an energy center that basically allows them to keep working. And I find it interesting because even if it's a model that doesn't absolutely describe like, everything, how everything is in the world, I think it's a useful model to think about people yeah, I'm just gonna offer the view of like models are wrong but useful to talk about it. But basically, like when I started realizing how I'm a manifesting generator, by the way, if that makes a difference. But the idea of liking work and actually being inherently driven to work, and that how that is, part of our nature, has always been something that I intuitively felt is true. And it's nice to see some corroborative, um, not necessarily evidence, but maybe observations of a similar nature. So the idea that a lot of people in the world actually do like to work once you divide work out from its capitalist tendencies. So after all this very lengthy conversation, I think for me, I've reached now a point where I can finally see that, like, it's not weird to enjoy work, especially not once you've divided it from capitalism. My previous immediate notions to kind of just like rebel against work and all that stuff, my hippie phase of things, and my immediate urgent reach for fun employment, and what that looked like for me, were kind of born of the best understanding I had of that time, of not being able to see work without capitalism being involved, and to kind of grapple with the seemingly contradictory notions of liking work and being too embarrassed to admit it, because I think it's not cool to like work in a capitalist society, But like at the same time, also for some reason at sometimes hating work, because mostly because I'm doing work that probably sometimes doesn't make full sense to me, or feels like it's not really in service of things that I believe in. But just I think in general, being forced to work in a way that's kind of like looking at output, needing to be consistently productive as if we are machines, and kind of neglecting the idea of how, like, if we talk about work, there is some form of input, then there's a bit of like a black box, and then there's some form of output, right? I think with the way capitalism views work, it doesn't really care so much about the input or the black box. What it really cares about is the output. The output needs to be consistent. So what I did in service of that output was to put myself through a horrible phase where I basically slave drive myself, where I think we go through cycles of like being more productive and less productive, if you want to look at it in terms of output sense. But to kind of force myself to give a consistent output across time, I then had to either increase my input to a lot during periods where I wasn't as productive, or like during periods where I was really in the flow state and like I was doing things really quickly, I could then put in a lot less input, which isn't really the problem. The problem is really the periods where I felt like I wasn't productive, I wasn't giving enough output, and then I had to force myself to exponentially increase my input in order to fit into this black box of like I don't know how work works, but then to produce a certain output for capitalism, right? I think that was the issue of viewing work through a capitalist lens, which is that I'm really only valuing the output, and valuing the output in terms of its consistency and meeting a certain like minimum standard. But like I think the way I'm more comfortable with thinking about work is as a whole process. I'll talk more about this in another video, because if not this will get too long. But like I think work doesn't need to be looked at only in terms of output, and definitely not in terms of only consistent output, which is I think a value that capitalism puts onto work. But it's not a value that I need to stand by, and it's not something that I necessarily need to value in and of itself. I can look at it as a whole system, I can look at it as the input, the black box, or the output. And also in general, what is this work serving, right? And I think being able to have that wider lens, scoping out, has helped me really get a better grasp of what work means to me, how my identity is in terms of work, which is, I am someone who likes work, but I just, like, capitalism is a whole other beast that is not relevant to my valuation of my work. And my identity doesn't necessarily need to be more or less more or less valued because of the kind of work that I do. So I hope this was an interesting view and perspective about work and capitalism. I talked about this recently with a friend and she found it insightful, and as I was explaining all these thoughts to her, I came into better understanding of it myself, and I wanted to really share this on this channel. So I hope that was useful. Let me know what you think about work, about identity, about capitalism, and whether this video gave you any interesting insights, or if you have any interesting insights to share, let me know in the comments below. It's starting to rain, so I'm gonna end this video here, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.